Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan and welcome to Words in Time. Now in today's video we have the second matchup in my bracket to determine my favorite decade of sci-fi. In today's match we have the 2000s going up against the 2010s. Now of course I can't compare every book from each decade, so instead what I'm going to be doing is comparing my top 5 against my top 5. We have 5 against 4 against 3s against 2s against 1s, to determine which is going to be going through to the next round of my Sci-Fi Decade Bracket Challenge. Let's get into it. First up, we have my 5th favorite sci-fi book of the 2000s, Old Man's War by John Scalzi, going up against my 5th favorite sci-fi book of the 2010s, Leviathan Wakes by James S.A. Corey. So, starting with Old Man's War, this is a fun, fairly fast-paced adventure in the tradition of military sci-fi, with a little bit of a twist in that the recruits are seniors, elderly people, which I quite enjoyed. So this is quite entertaining, it's quite a funny book. Not all of the humor lands for me, but more often than not I was enjoying it, and I like the twist on the genre, and I like the homage to books like Forever War by Joe Haldeman, which it took some inspiration from, and I think it had some really interesting ideas, sci-fi ideas, technologies, concepts, especially in the second half of the book. I did enjoy it, although I didn't feel compelled to continue with the series, so let me know what you think of the rest of the Old Man's War series by John Scalzi if you've read it. So, moving on to Leviathan Wakes by James S.A. Corey, the first book in the hit series The Expanse. I've read the first 4 and this is still my favorite. I really enjoyed Leviathan Wakes. I think you have a great setup, these different POVs. We have Holden, constantly wants to do good, constantly making terrible decisions, and Miller, a bit of a tropey, grizzled detective, but he had a lot of personality, had a lot of insights. I enjoyed the detective journey in space that he took us on. So this was a real page turner, 500 and something pages, and I blew through it. A real adventure with some kind of cool sci-fi concepts. It's fairly grounded because it's near future, but things like the proto-molecule and some things that it sets up for later in the series I thought was really well done. I thought that it really ramped up towards an ending where I thought this was going to be one of my favorite ever books, and the ending was fine. It just didn't quite blow me away to take it to that absolute top tier, but a really, really good read. 2 good books, but I think just for the overall pacing, enjoyment factor, I'm going to have to go with Leviathan Wakes. So, there we go. After our first matchup, the score is 1-0 in favor of the 2010s. Next up, we have my 4th favorite sci-fi book of the 2000s, Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, going up against my 4th favorite sci-fi book of the 2010s, The Martian by Andy Weir. So, starting off with Cloud Atlas, and these are 2 very different books. We have Cloud Atlas, which has a very interesting structure, the Russian nesting doll kind of structure, where we have multiple POVs, multiple stories that are told in the order of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So this is a very interesting approach to storytelling, and I really enjoy trying to make the connections between the stories because it wasn't overt, but some of them were direct, some of them were a bit more conceptual. So that was a really interesting journey. Although I will say I didn't enjoy all of the stories equally. That 6th story, the Slooshes, the language, the writing style was a little tough to get through, but luckily that was bookended by number 5, which I believe was Sonmi 451. I might have got my order incorrect there, but Sonmi's story, that was my favorite, of course, because it was the most sci-fi, but some really cool concepts there, and the way it came together I thought was such an impressive thing. It really stuck the emotional landing for me. In terms of final lines, final sentences of a novel, this might be my favorite. I can think of a couple off the top of my head, and Cloud Atlas is definitely one of them. I don't want to give it away, but if you read the book or if you've read the book, either now or come back later, whenever you read it, let me know what you think of the final line, because I absolutely love it. Now, moving on to The Martian. Completely different kind of story. We have a first-person POV. We're with our unfortunate Mars adventurer, Mark Watney, the whole way, and nothing seems to go right for this guy. Mars is constantly trying to kill him, and he has to rely on his physics skills, his mathematics skills that he applies in a MacGyver-esque fashion in order to survive over and over again. And the fact that it makes science cool, I think is really, really fun and really, really impressive. One of my favorite scenes in this book is him trying to triangulate an incoming dust storm, and it's like, yeah, man, I never thought I'd be on the edge of my seat for trigonometry, and yet I was. So, two books that I enjoy a lot for different reasons. Cloud Atlas, a bit of an emotional connection to, and The Martian, just a real fun adventure. I think in terms of which achieves the goals that it set out to do better, for me, I'm gonna have to go with The Martian. I really love that book. Big fan of Andy Weir, big fan of Project Hail Mary as well. So there we go. 2010s now up 2-0. They got out to an early lead, but the 60s did that against the 50s, and the 50s managed a little bit of a comeback. So stick around for the third matchup, which is my third favorite sci-fi book of the 2000s, The Three-Body Problem by Cixin Liu. Going up against my third favorite sci-fi book of the 2010s, Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. Now, these two are a little bit more similar in style, both kind of high concept ideas. I'm going to start with The Three-Body Problem, and just to clarify, this is in the 2000s, not the 2010s, because I went by the original Chinese release date as opposed to the English translation. So, Three-Body Problem representing the 2000s with a story that is very based in physics, very based in big, high concept sci-fi ideas, my kind of sci-fi. I love that kind of thing. This book I just read quite recently, and it's been rattling around in my brain for days since. I have been thinking about it a lot, which is definitely evidence of a book that I enjoyed. I did have some minor issues with it in terms of the structure and the writing style, but I think over time, as I get away from the actual reading experience, that's going to fade away, and it's going to be the ideas that stick with me. And I haven't read the rest of the series yet, but I'll be definitely getting onto those soon, so stick around for that. Now, in terms of our 2010s representative, we have Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. I have reviewed this on the channel, and I absolutely loved it. I love the idea, which I don't really want to get into, but it does play around with things like realities, universe, what's real, what's not real, getting to the bottom of it, using physics in a real page-turning type way. It's only around 300 pages or so, absolutely smashed through it in a couple of sittings. I think it also had some minor shortcomings in terms of the writing. Perhaps it could have hit some stronger emotional beats. The prose, I think it services the story that it's trying to tell, but it could be a little bit more poetic or impactful at times. And while the characters, I think I cared about, I was invested in, and not the most memorable characters either. I think that the story, the ideas are really the focus of Dark Matter. So, which of these two big picture sci-fi books am I going to go for? Well, I love the ideas in both of them, but I think when it comes to story, pacing, and even characters to an extent, I'm going to lean towards Dark Matter. Absolutely love that book, love Blake Crouch, love Recursion, and I'm going to be reading his Wayward Pines trilogy soon as well. So there we go, 2010s getting out to a big lead, but you're going to want to stick around to hear what is my number 2 and my number 1 sci-fi book of each decade. Okay, with our second final matchup, we have my second favorite sci-fi book of the 2000s, Spin by Robert Charles Wilson, going up against my second favorite sci-fi book of the 2010s, Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Now, Spin is sense of wonder sci-fi. I love the premise for this book. What if one day the stars disappeared? And we follow 3 childhood friends that are now adults as they try to figure out why the stars have disappeared, what does that mean, and what should they do next. Now, this book does some interesting things in terms of time and structure with some flashbacks and flash forwards, and it really hits a lot of great sci-fi beats for me in terms of the ideas. I constantly wanted to know more, I didn't want to miss a word in the story, and it had me hooked the whole time. I think the characters are perhaps a little tropey, a little bit 2D. You could kind of place each of them into a box, but I think it worked. I think I like the dynamic between the 3, and I did care about them. I was invested in them. This is something I enjoyed from the first page to the final page. Absolutely phenomenal book. Now, Children of Time, another great premise. We have humans trying to colonize a new planet, and they infect it with a nanovirus to try and speed up intelligence growth. but they end up infecting alien spiders. So we get to see these alien spiders evolve over a long period of time as these humans try to find a planet to colonize and survive on. So great storytelling there, great concepts. And I'll be honest, I enjoyed the first 2/3, but the final third is where Children of Time really shines. The emotional impact of the messages of connectivity, empathy, touched me so deeply. It went beyond the scope of sci-fi and affected me as a person, not just as a reader. So, two phenomenal books that are right at the top of my lists. It's very hard to compare because I enjoyed Spin all the way through, whereas I thought Children of Time kind of ramped up to what was an almost perfect ending. I think about them both a lot, but I think the emotional impact of Children of Time has to give it the win. I love that book. I'm deeply connected to it. I'm a big fan. Can't recommend it enough. So 4-0, 2010s giving the 2000 an absolute kicking. Let's see if they can finish off a clean sweep as I reveal my favorite book of each decade. Here we are with our final matchup, my number one sci-fi book of the 2000s, House of Suns by Alistair Reynolds, going up against my number one sci-fi book of the 2010s, Demon in White by Christopher Rocchio. Now, I did actually recently get to interview Christopher Rocchio alongside Treebeard Book Reviews on his channel, so go ahead and check out that video. It was a lot of fun. It's a great discussion. The first half is spoiler-free, and then in the second half, we really get into the Sun Eater series. So, back to the matchup with House of Suns. This book blew my mind every 50 pages. The amount of sci-fi concepts that Alistair Reynolds packs into this book, which are not only individual hits, but add to the story as a whole, is an absolute accomplishment. I think it's a landmark achievement in science fiction. The premise for the book is we have a character, Abigail Gentian, and she clones herself 999 times. And these 1,000 clones, known as Shadowlings, travel across the galaxy and then get together for reunions, I believe every 100,000 years or so. And this particular reunion that we follow, they are attacked and they need to figure out by whom and why. So it's a great mystery, awesome sci-fi concepts, awesome characters. I don't have a bad word to say about House of Suns. Can't recommend it enough. If you haven't read it, stop the video, read it now, come back, play the video, and get hyped about House of Suns alongside me. Now, moving on to Demon in White. This was one of my favorite books that I read last year. Maybe my favorite. Check out my top 10 reads of 2021 if you haven't seen that video. And Sun Eater is my favorite current sci-fi series. I think in this book we get a lot of what I already enjoyed about the series in terms of the world building. The prose is magnificent. I love Hadrian as a main character, and I love the secondary characters as well. It hits in terms of the sci-fi concepts, it hits in terms of the themes. I love the blending of sci-fi and fantasy. It takes you on a real journey. And I think it elevated the series to new heights. I think it hit even higher emotional beats, and those concepts that kind of get a bit out there, kind of take this from your standard space opera to, okay, this is something pretty special. I think elevated the book. Each book, it gets better and better. And I loved Empire of Silence, but Howling of Dark and then Demon in White took the series to new levels, and I cannot wait for Kingdoms of Death. So how do I pick a winner between these two favorites? Well, I think both of them are close to perfection. If I could find any remote nitpick at all, it's that Demon in White, it's an 800-page book. It's hard for every chapter to be as good as the others. It's hard to keep the pacing perfect just in terms of my own reading, personal preferences the whole way through. It's a pretty minor gripe, but I have to pick something when I have two near perfect books. So for those reasons, House of Suns and the 2000s avoid a clean sweep, but the 2010s do take it, a final score of 4-1. They'll be moving on to the next round. So I hope you enjoyed the video, guys. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you haven't watched it yet, check out the first match between the 1950s and 1960s.